Okay, guys, today I want to continue my coverage of the opening tables in Murray's History of Chess. Uh, I am continuing with Muj versus Sheik, or the Mujannah opening versus the Sheik opening. Um, as you know, decoding Murray's tables is a bit of a mess. They were done before algebraic notation was standardized, so they were done in, I believe, 1913. And of course, Murray is then summarizing work that was written in longhand form in the 800s AD, which has been copied from manuscripts. Essentially, had been copied on down, into the 1100s, 1200s. So by the time that all this information is getting to you, there have there's been quite a mess created, and what I've done is really gone through and tried to figure out what I think Al-Lajlaj actually said and what his ideas were, and so that's what I want to share with you today. So, the starting position for today's lecture uh, actually occurs. So right here in the position that I have on the board. This was the starting position. It was copied. It was a diagram that was in Al-Lajlaj's book. And the position starts here, and we're given the move c takes d5. Okay. So how exactly did we get here? Well, we don't really know. The move order that Murray gives is highly implausible. So what I've done here is I've just taken one of my games against Rosha. I had the black pieces, and this is just going to be my substitute move order. So four pawns. Of course, probably in the 800s they open. They would have brought the pawn to c4 right away, but uh, really, this is about the best we can do. So this gives us some kind of semblance of a logical move order. We do know a few things from Al-Lajlaj's comments, and then from some of the other variations in games that he gives in terms of move order. So we know that he wasn't a big fan of fe6 here. Um, we know that Al-Lajlaj thought that you should leave the firzan back just a little bit in case f4, f5 were to come with tempo. Um, exactly how that would happen was never made clear, but it's just a comment that he makes. And in a lot of the other starting positions, the firzan is either left on f7 or it's still on e8. So he probably didn't like fe6 right away. What did he like? Well, probably he liked a6, followed by maybe bishop d6 fairly soon. Just from some of the other diagrams that were his starting positions, you'll see these pawns kind of pushed first before you see the firzan come up or the bishop come up. Um, is it really significant? No, I mean, I think nowadays we pretty much have analyzed all this stuff. So we know, for instance, we know that you don't have to preface bishop d6 with a6. So for instance, if instead of rook b1, if you were to play c takes, knight b5, this doesn't really do anything. Black can just hop the bishop back, play a6, next move, and then come out with a bishop again. So um, it seems like players were cautious in the old days and tended to play a6 early, but I don't typically play that way just because it's not necessary. We know b6 is probably a little earlier than Al-Lajlaj would have played it. He would have played a6 right away. Given some of the other diagrams and in a lot of his other analysis, black has omitted the move b6, but black never omits pawn to a6. Um, so, oh, and for the actual position that I'm trying to reach here after bishop d6, rather than rook to b1, I'm thinking that probably the move order was pawn to a3. Again, this is just my speculation, but we know that in the game that we're going to look at today, white plays the rook to a2 rather than playing it to b1. So b6, rook a2, this is my guess as to the move order, a6, and now b4. I'm assuming that white waits to play b4 until bishop a6, targeting the weakened c4 pawn, is no longer a possibility. So if black play, so that's why I suppose a6 and then b4 occurs. Just my thought, but we don't really know. g6, and then bishop to h3. It's possible that white played bishop to h3 first and bishop to h3 first with the idea of f4, f5 in order to provoke black into playing g6. So again, that's when we don't really know. So in terms of move order, it's possible that black played h6 here just to cover up the g5 square. Bishop to h3 with the sort of threat of playing pawn to f5, because the idea is if black takes, then he's going to weaken his defense of the d5 pawn. So, like let's say if black played king to e8 here, you could see f5, takes, knight takes, and then c takes d5, c takes d5, and knight takes when white is much, much better. So, so it's possible that the move order saw bishop to h3 provoking pawn to g6, but we don't really know. So, instead of pawn to h6, let's see, pawn to g6, bishop to h3, and now the move h6, and the move given here is c takes d5. So, all right, I've got to get out my notes because, I will tell you this stuff is not easy to follow. As it's written in the Murray table. So I've made notes for myself to follow in this lecture in algebraic notation. Okay, so what can we say about this position? Well, first I'll say as far as I can tell, this is a sample game that Al-Lajlaj gives. We don't know who the players were. But we're going to go 35, 40 moves deep, and it's highly implausible that the idea was to actually give analysis, in particular since a lot of the moves that black plays are not going to be the best ones, and Al-Lajlaj is going to note that. In terms of who the players were, it's possible that Al-Lajlaj was the player with the white pieces. That wouldn't surprise us because Al-Lajlaj was a big believer in the Muj as an opening with the white pieces. And he didn't think particularly highly of the Sheik. Asuli also didn't think particularly highly of the Sheik. And since white is going to win this game pretty decisively, that could give us some clues as to why these great aliyat of the 9th century tended to dislike the Sheik and played against the Muj. So it's possible that Al-Lajlaj or Asuli has the white pieces. And then what can we say about the structure? Well, this idea of playing rook to a2 is not something that we've seen a lot today. But I don't think there's a particularly good reason that we haven't seen it. So in terms of, how do white players today handle the Sheik? Well, when the pawns are still on a2 and b3, we see a lot of rook b1, we see rook g2, rook c2, and we see a lot of b4, c5, this kind of action. And we typically see a lot of play on the Shah side. And I think this makes sense because most Muj players are Shah side players. If you think back to my lectures on the double Mujannah, you recall that in the double Mujannah, white always wants to go for a Shah side attack. But the move rook to a2 is definitely not playing for an all-out attack on the Shah side, because the idea is going to be to do a rook left over to one of these squares. So I think it's very interesting to see, okay, what exactly is White's plan? Well, you notice that the bishop came out to h3. This is also a little bit different than how a lot of modern players handle this structure. And so the idea is to couple bishop h3 with a rook left over to the firzan-side, and White is simply going to play for g4 and f5 to try to crack open the firzan-side. Well, okay, so why is White doing this? Traditionally we say when you can, you should always attack on the Shah side. Well, really the reason that White is going to try this firzan-side attack is because the g6 square has already been weakened. There isn't a possibility, given how open these pawns are, that Black is just going to be able to camp out with a firzan on f7 for the entire game, and White is never going to break through. We saw that kind of thing happening in the double Mujannah structures, but in this structure, Black has already committed pretty much everything on the firzan flank. So we're going to see White trying to puncture a hole in the defense this side. Well, why isn't so that's why White should attack on the firzan side. And then on the flip side, should White be trying for a Shah side attack? Well, Black does have a lot of pieces on the Shah side, and Black, in fact, is ready at some point to strike with b5 himself, and then to meet c5 with a5 at the right moment. So Black does have pretty good play on the Shah side, or at least I should say counterplay. So if White starts playing on the Shah side, the theory at least is that Black has enough pieces on the Shah side to counterattack on the same side of the board, basically, as well as in the center. So I think that's the theory behind this illustrative game that I'm going to show, is that White should try for the firzan-side attack because these pawns are committed. Is this really objectively best play for White? I think a lot remains to be seen. But in any case, here White makes the very committal move, c takes d5. And well, it should be noted, okay, if Black plays firzan takes d5, this is a pretty big concession, because White isn't going to have the two center pawns. So one way for White to play in these kinds of structures, play f takes, e4, force the firzan back. And then a typical way to continue play is to bring the firzan up to e3 and play for d3, d4, trying to get very good play on the dark squares in the center. So I do have one fairly nice game. I didn't manage to win it. I came very close, but I have one game against Rickard in that kind of position. So I will try to post a link to it in the notes so that you can take a look at that structure. And I think the same thing typically goes for knight takes d5. So the exact correct move here can be debated. Maybe it's knight to e2 followed by e4. Maybe White just goes ahead and takes on d5 anyway, with the idea of f takes d5, e4 back, and then going into this structure. So the exact move order would, you might want to work it out, but in any case, it stands to reason that c takes d5 is going to be the main move. After all, Black has a space advantage in the center, and Black is going to want to keep pieces on the board in order to try to make something of that structure. or make something of that space. So c takes d5 forces c takes d5, and now white is going to have some play along the open c file. Of course, that means black may have play along the c file as well with rook a7 and rook c7, or rook a7 and rook c7. So, so c takes d5, c takes d5, and now white goes ahead and plays f takes on e5. And if you followed some of my other lectures, you'll know I'm typically not a big fan of the lines where white plays c takes and f takes, because I feel like it gives black a really big space advantage, essentially for free. But Al-Lajlaj has a very concrete idea for white here, and I think it's very interesting because it's not something that is seen hardly at all today. Usually, if white's playing c takes and f takes in modern games, the idea is simply to try to create this sort of even pawn structure, put a rook on the c file, put a rook on the f file, and suffer to a draw. But white's very concrete idea here is pawn to g4. Okay, why is white playing pawn to g4? Well, white is continuing the idea of a firzan-side attack, and he's aiming for the move g5. So what happens next is very, very interesting. So black plays rook to f8, which seems like a normal move. White plays rook to f1, which to me sort of is admitting in a way that maybe white's opening play wasn't the most accurate, because white has moved this rook twice and probably improvements could be found so that he wouldn't have to do this. Personally, I think maybe bringing the rook on a to f2 would be one way to handle this. But in any case, it's not much of a concession to move the rook again. So we see rook to g1. And here I think we can tell a lot about the state of chess in the 800s, because here black plays the move pawn to g5. And although Al-Lajlaj gives many, many comments and annotations throughout this annotated game, he never once calls attention to the fact that g5 is a very, very bad move. So most strong players today, just because of the knowledge we have from modern chess, are going to know that the move g5 critically weakens the f5 square. It also weakens h5. And white immediately seizes on this by playing pawn to e4, creating this wonderful outpost for the elephant on the f5 square. Never mind that black is also going to get an outpost on f4. The outpost on f5 is going to be much more useful to white than the f4 square is going to be for black, because white is going to be the one calling the shots on the firzan-side and trying to get an attack there. So the move pawn to g5 is a very, very weakening move. And I think it's interesting that Al-Lajlaj doesn't really comment on how weakening it is. So if I were to have this position with black, the modern approach would certainly just be something like rook to a7. And okay, so here if white does continue with the plan of pawn to g5, black has a number of options here. So one, he can simply push past. And yes, it's a little bit annoying that white gained this space, but it doesn't really do a lot to change the evaluation of the position. Black is going to be able to amply defend this pawn on g6, and it's not clear how white's going to break through. So the plan probably involves, to the extent that white has a good way to break through, it probably involves maybe getting a firzan into g3 and then trying to play for d3 to d4. Then when black pushes past, trying to get the knight into e5, and then eventually hoping to run this firzan down the board and into the f6 square. But it seems like that's going to be a bit of a long shot. Black has very good control of the center. He's going to have rook to c7, giving white a little bit of problems down the c file. And black is going to have probably just not that much trouble defending. The other way, well, black could approach it with h takes g5. Now knight takes g5, bishop take, or rook takes, bishop takes. Notice the firzan is not hanging because the elephant guards it. So here, again, white probably has a slight advantage because this rook is going to have trouble getting over to the open lines on the firzan side. But it doesn't seem that critical. So, rook to c7, attacking this knight. The knight is kind of in search of a home. Maybe it's going to go to e2. It seems like black ought to be able to hold this position without too much trouble. Probably knight to f6, and then black can consider playing pawn to e4, just trying to gain a little bit of space. If worse comes to worse, maybe this king can run over, sit on g7, although no, I think probably knight to f6. Maybe white plays knight to g3. White's kind of given up his pressure on these pawns, so these knights are free to move. Black can play knight to c6 now. Black can even try knight to f5. But just knight to c6, and the rook has gained access to the squares along black's 7th rank, and so black ought to be able to defend this without too much difficulty. And white has some things to worry about too. Bishop takes b4 is threatened. So, after g5, h takes, maybe rook g2 is the right move. And just hoping to retake with a rook. I tend to think that black is going to have adequate resources to defend it, so rook to c7, just attack the knight. Knight is driven away, and in terms of counterplay, there's some different ways that this could go. Black could maybe try b5, try to get knight in. Black can even try pawn to a5, try to get a little space. Rook to h8, just attacking this elephant. That could get a little bit annoying. Sort of forces white's hand. White's going to have to take knight takes g5. Black probably is going to play king to e8. This looks like it looks like a relatively pleasant game for white, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be the kind of straightforward plan to break through that we see in the game. So I find the move g5 surprising, and I think interesting that Al-Lajlaj doesn't comment on it. Rook to a7, g5, h takes, rook to g2. There's probably something here for white. It looks like a bit of a pull, but certainly with white, I would be very happy to see a weakening move like g5. So e4 was played. Al-Lajlaj gives in the comments, not bishop immediately because takes, and then rook takes. Knight takes isn't possible because the pawn on d5 hangs. But of course, white isn't going to go that route, so that's a bit of a trivial pointer. So e4, and here black plays d4, which seems perfectly natural. Black needs to control the e3 square to prevent bishop e3, and bishop takes g5. So knight to e2. Well, and actually, I think it's knight. Yeah, knight to b1 was the game move. So the reason that white played this way is because he's going for knight bd2 and knight b3, and that was the preference rather than playing knight to e2, and then fairly natural knight to g3 and knight to h5. I guess the idea is that white felt the knight on h5 would not do as much as just having the knight on b3. And to kind of go with that, so why would white want a knight on b3 rather than on h5? h5 looks like a very aggressive square. Well, I think one clue that we're given comes in a sort of an offhand comment that Al-Lajlaj makes at some point, where he says that very often in these structures, white will play firzan up either to d2 or f2, and then we'll play bishop to e3 with the idea of bishop takes g5 or invading on the c5 square. And then after black plays d takes e3, white will come up, capture with a firzan, getting a good firzan up on the e3 square, which further allows him to try to penetrate the position with d3, d4. And the hope is that this firzan will just waltz in on the dark squares, where it will just wreak havoc on the black position. So Al-Lajlaj makes a comment that this often happens. So it seems like this was just a very important structural concern. And so I think when white plays knight to b1 with the idea of bringing the knight to b3, white already has rolling in mind the idea of an eventual break with pawn to d4. So that's just kind of my thought as to why knight b1 is played. Black played knight to g6 here, which is natural, just controlling some good squares. So after knight g6, well, and Al-Lajlaj gives one comment. He says knight c6 immediately would be met by rook to c2, just sort of chasing the knight away, or else, forcing black's king to a very awkward square. So black doesn't gain anything by that. And that seems accurate. If black is going to play knight c6, which I think is a legitimate idea, he should lead with rook to a7, so that then he plays rook c7 and knight c6. But in any case, the game went knight g6. And here we saw elephant to f5. The knight's threatened, so it has to come to g6, and then we just see pawn to h3 to defend the pawn on g4. And here black plays rook to a7, just getting the rook active, and I think this is the most natural move. Al-Lajlaj gives one other line. He says, if bishop to f4, he says white will play rook to g1. So notice, what is white's plan here? White's plan is actually just to get this rook back on g1 and then start a smash, just trying to smash the pawns through on the firzan side before black has time to fully develop. So rook g1, rook a7. Now white plays pawn to h4, which is pawn sacrifice, but the idea is after g takes, White plays pawn to g5. H takes g. Rook takes g5. And now the line Al-Lajlaj gives is rook to g8. However, this doesn't work because then knight takes e5. And knight takes e5, rook take. Well, no, actually, yeah. So, so that's interesting. So rook to g8. Yeah, and here the move given is knight takes e5 as winning. And I think the idea was that there was a pin, but it doesn't appear to work right away. Looking at this, so it's pretty easy to figure out, okay, what was meant by this. Probably rook g2 first, and now rook g7, and then knight takes e5, with the idea of knight takes and rook takes. So that's probably what it should have said. So either it's a mess up in my notes, but I think more likely it's a mistake in the manuscripts or in Murray. So rook f to g2. Maybe there are some other moves here. Looking at it, maybe bringing the firzan back would be a more accurate way to play. But I think the basic idea here is just supposed to be that white has very, very good play along the g file. And so white has really good compensation for the pawn. And that assessment to me looks more or less accurate. It seems to, in my mind, black misplayed this when he played pawn to g5. But bishop to f4 probably is an inaccuracy because it does not do nearly as much as rook to a7. And I think that is the point that Al-Lajlaj is making in this line. So rook to a7, white plays knight to d2. But here we see what strikes me as a very big mistake for black. And again, Al-Lajlaj doesn't really comment on it. So black played pawn to b5. The idea is not clear. Maybe black was planning to play a5 with counterplay. But, of course, the problem is something like this. So rook to c2, black played rook to c7, and then white just played takes, and knight to b3, and now we see that black has really, really weakened these squares. So the move b5 also strikes me as just a very bad move. Well, what should black play? I mean, maybe now was the time for bishop to f4 when it attacks this knight. Although that would allow knight to c4 and okay, the pawn on. Oh, okay, all right. So yeah, I need to go back and say, all right, I now understand what the move pawn to b5 was to prevent. Okay, the move pawn to b5 is to prevent knight to c4 surrounding and winning the e5 pawn. Okay. So yeah, the question is then, is this forced? Because if so, that's very, very sad for black because it creates a huge weakness. So since knight c5 and knight takes e5 is threatened, what can black do to stop that? Well, here's a line that's not given by Al-Lajlaj. Maybe black should try a little bit more active play. Maybe it takes with the idea of takes knight to f4, forking these pawns. But again, nah. Looks like looks like the black position in the center just totally collapses there. Because the knight's coming into c6 with check. So okay, so yeah, so f takes f5 doesn't work. Yeah, the e5 pawn. E5 pawn is a really, really big problem for black. So okay, I understand the move b5 now. I don't think I see anything better. But this means that This means that the position is very, very good for white, because after rook c2, takes, king takes, and knight to b3, now black is in really bad shape. So black plays king to b6 in the game. King to d8 is a line that Al-Lajlaj gives, and he says that it's a bad move because it'd be met by knight to c6, threatening knight c6 and coming back in and taking on e5. And that makes sense to me. The king can't come to d7 to defend because of the elephant controlling that square. So not king to d8, but rather king to b6, just hanging on to the c6 square. Well, where are we now? Well, white is going to basically win this game by shuffling between attacking on the firzan-side and attacking on the shah-side, because both sides are really weak. So white plays rook to f2, and the idea is now to just set up a mating net. White's going to play knight to a5, rook to c2, and then rook to c6, with the idea of, okay, king to a7, then play check, king comes back, rook to b7 will be mate. So that is white's idea with rook to f2. Black has to do something to defend this. So rook to f7 with the idea of rook to c7 was the move played in the game. Al-Lajlaj gives, for instance, if black just plays any random rook move, then after knight to a5, after rook c2 and rook c6, he says that white will be winning there. I don't disagree with that. It's also around here that Al-Lajlaj makes this rather telling comment that besides bringing the knight to a5, the other plan for white is to play firzan to d2, followed by bishop to e3, threatening bishop takes g5, force black to play d takes e3, and then the firzan will come up to e3, where it supports a d3, d4 push. And he says this generally happens. So that's just how we know that this was also a plan that came up frequently. So in the game after rook f2, black played rook to f7. White plays knight to a5 with the idea of coming into the c6 square. Black plays rook to c7 to stop all of this. And here white plays rook to g2. So white has made all of the progress that he can on the shah side, so he's going to switch back to the firzan side. So here black finally cracks under pressure and plays rook to f7, which is apparently a blunder. As we'll see, rook to g7 would have held the defense. And white would not now have the opportunity to crack through on the firzan side. So I guess this would be the point that Al-Lajlaj would go ahead and try for this, like firzan to d2, followed by bishop to e3 maneuver, trying to force black to play d takes and then getting the good firzan on e3. So that's what I think is supposed to happen after rook to g7. But instead, black plays rook to f7, and now white has a really nice pawn sacrifice with the move pawn to h4. So, well, and it's not actually, I guess, a pawn, not actually a pawn sacrifice. So, um, so black plays g takes h4. The idea, so yeah, so after knight takes h4, what the comment actually says, let me just make sure we're on the correct move. Yeah. So the comment that's actually in Murray is that after knight takes h4, white would play knight takes e5 here. And okay, I'm just looking at this, and that doesn't strike me as right, because after knight takes g2, knight takes f7, then we just have Firzan taking on f7. So yeah, so looking at that, that does not strike me as correct. So it's hard to know whether there's just an error in something that one of the manuscript copiers did, or if it's a problem with Murray's translation. Um, but I think after knight takes h4, well, white's probably just going to continue with knight takes h4, g takes, and here maybe rook h2, or maybe pawn to g5. Well, yeah, so actually pawn to g5 is met by rook g7 with this pin, so that's a problem. And then rook to h2 is met by knight takes g4, takes h4, bishop to f8. Well, not bishop to f8. The knight has to be saved, so I guess that's going to be rook g7. But it seems like black's holding this just fine. The bishop's going to come to f8. And it doesn't seem like black has any real problems here. So yeah, I'm just gonna back up for 1 second to a position that I had diagrammed. Yeah, yeah, and it's true. So um, looks like uh, rook to f7, pawn to h4. Yeah, it looks like knight takes h4 is perfectly possible here. Yeah, well, and that's just kind of a shame. The text gets really messy, and everything's very hard to decipher. So, I'm not really surprised. Um, I mean, if you want an alternate ending to this, in terms of, well, how would you want to play your own games? Um, yeah, probably you can imagine a world in which white just plays Firzan to d2 and then follows up with this bishop e3 maneuver, and at some point gets a break h4. And that ought to be, it ought to be good enough. With a little bit of imagination, you can see white winning this. Although you do also have to wonder in this exact position, uh, if maybe there wasn't a shot missed with something like knight to f4, hitting the rook, um, and rook to h2, maybe takes, knight takes d3. And now the elephant on c1 is under attack. And it's true that white's attacking the e5 pawn, but black's holding it for now. So this kind of thing looks really messy. Black's going to play knight takes e4. So, um, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, kind of disappointing. It also doesn't help that Murray, relying on the original text, right around here starts to give the variation as like black plays rook to any square, basically along the lines of uh, the players couldn't exactly remember how the game went, so. Uh, So the line that happened in the game um, was rook g2, I guess rook to f7, and now pawn to h4. And okay, black played g takes h4. Now white continue with pawn to h5, h takes g5, rook takes g5, so white has now smashed the firzan side, and then after rook to g7, white was able to continue with knight takes e5 with a pin on g7. So, very interesting comment Al-Lajlaj gives is white can play the rather hilarious knight to c6 here instead, with the idea of king takes, rook takes g6, rook takes g6, knight takes e5, king to b6, and knight takes g6, when white is up a little bit of material, I guess. Well, actually, so material's even, I guess, but the black h pawn is going to fall, so white's probably going to win this, and also the move e5 is kind of hanging in the air. So, so knight c6 is given as an interesting alternative, but knight takes e5 is decisive here. So after knight takes e5, the knight's threatened, but it's pinned. So black plays firzan to f7. But then, yeah, the winning strike is just knight takes f7, and after rook takes f7, rook takes g6. The annotations for Al-Lajlaj just end saying essentially, white's winning now. So we can imagine that white went on to win this game, being up, just having such a much better position as he does, and being up a firzan. So that is the game. I know that the manuscripts leave a lot to be desired right around here because we don't exactly know what the moves were with the rooks, and it seems to me that after g4, probably knight takes g4, hitting this rook would have been a much better move. So it does seem like something is lost in the annotations and translations over the centuries. But what can we take away from this game? Well, for me, the very interesting idea here is that, contrary to the way that pretty much everybody is playing these kinds of Muj versus Sheik positions today, Al-Lajlaj thought it was a decent idea to play the rook lift and to go into attacking on the firzan side. I think there is a certain amount of logic to this, given that black is well defended on the Shah side. And then the other thing that I really like about this game for white is just the extent to which white really plays some good positional chess right around here. So I guess I have to adapt a little bit what I said, with when I was talking about this position, and I said, well, knight to e2 versus knight to b1. I think the direct idea with knight to b1 is actually that the knight's going to come to c4, pressure e5, and force this b5 concession from black, which is a huge concession, allowing white to bring the knight to a5. So, so even just doing this lecture, I've gained a lot of respect for the move knight b1 there. I think that was very strong. And then, I kind of think the point to think about in terms of the theory and where this could go if we were to play it in some modern games, I think that black really has to consider in this position after rook to f1 trying something other than the move pawn to g5, because that, to me, that just strikes me as committal. It puts the pawn on a square where this elephant will eventually target it, and it weakens the f5 square. So I think if black's looking for an improvement, this would be a good area to try to find some other way to interpret this position. Whether that's going to be rook a7, which would be kind of the obvious move, or whether that's going to be knight c6, targeting the b4 pawn, trying to get some counterplay that way. Whether it's even something a little bit more radical, like playing the move pawn to a5 here, just to create a break immediately. Looks risky, but at the same time trying to get play on the c5 square. So I think there are a lot of different approaches for black here, and as I sit here, I don't know what's best. And then in terms of opening play, where else could there be an improvement? I think it's possible that right around move 15 here, instead of h6, continuing to try to play on the Shah side for black, maybe with a move pawn to b5 or something could be an improvement. Rook a7 could be an improvement. Even king c7 with the idea of king to b7, which looks kind of funky, could be an improvement. The move pawn to h6 does allow white this opportunity to enter into the structure and try to use the g-pawn as a battering ram. So it's entirely possible that black is going to do better omitting that move. And then, of course, another idea that, of course, you have to look at is g takes, try this bishop sack, and then maybe just play king c7 with the idea of parking the king on d6. It feels a little premature for black to sacrifice that elephant, which had pretty good play. But on the other hand, there's going to be a big question of can white actually break through here on this structure? And it's not entirely clear to me how white's going to proceed. So this is just a kind of a first lecture. We're going to be doing a lot more Muj versus Sheik. This is to kind of whet your appetite for what some of the old ideas are and some of the very original ways that the players saw these positions over 1,000 years ago, and hopefully we can draw some inspiration from those games and find some novel paths forward in our games today. Thank you.